It was the middle of the night. On a small island off the coast of Alaska, a group of Russian fur traders had made camp. The sound of waves, the rustling of trees, everything seemed calm. Then the darkness came alive. Figures emerged from the shadows, charging into tents, cutting down guards, scattering men in every direction. The Russians fired back with muskets, but the bullets didn't seem to matter. The attackers wore wooden and hide armor, their faces hidden behind carved helmets shaped like snarling monsters. The expedition's leader, Alexander Baranov, would later write that in the darkness, the attackers looked more terrifying than the devils of hell themselves. It took cannon fire to finally drive them back. Baranov survived only because he happened to be wearing a coat of chainmail. These attackers were the Tlingit, the armored warrior people of the Alaskan coast, and this night was only the beginning of a war that history has almost completely forgotten. A war between the Russian Empire and a Native American nation that refused to be conquered. For centuries, Russia had been expanding, not west toward Europe, but east across the frozen expanse of Siberia. Under Ivan the Terrible, Russian forces pushed deeper into Asia. By the early 1700s, they had reached the edge of the continent. Beyond the water lay something unknown. In 1741, Danish-born explorer Vitus Bering led a Russian expedition that reached the shores of southeast Alaska. What his crew found in those waters would change everything. Sea otters by the thousands, with pelts so thick and luxurious that European markets couldn't get enough of them. Fur was money, and Alaska was full of it. Russian merchants flooded into the region. Leading them was Alexander Baranov, a relentless, ambitious man who would become the driving force of Russian expansion in North America. As head of the newly formed Russian-American Company, he pushed down the coast, hunting otters, building outposts, and planting the Russian flag wherever he could. But this coastline was not empty. Southeast Alaska, a landscape of fog-covered islands, snow-capped mountains, and dense old-growth forest. This was Tlingit territory. More than 10,000 people lived along this stretch of coastline, organized into powerful clans and lineages. Towering totem poles lined the shores, each one a record of ancestry, status, and identity carved in cedar. Life for the Tlingit revolved around the sea. In summer, entire communities moved to fishing camps to harvest the massive runs of salmon, drying and storing enough to last through the long winters. They supplemented this with halibut, seafish, seal, and deer. When winter came, the people returned to their large communal longhouses, where shamans performed ceremonies, chiefs displayed their wealth through elaborate feasts and gift-giving, and social rank was measured not by what you kept, but by what you gave away. But the Tlingit were not just fishermen and artists. They were warriors. Tlingit fighters went into battle wearing layered armor, thick hide underneath, wooden slat cuirasses on top, and helmets carved to resemble animal spirits or fearsome creatures. They fought with spears, daggers, and bows. For generations they had raided and warred against neighboring peoples, the Haida, the Tsimshian, taking captives, exacting revenge, and expanding their influence. These were the people Baranov was now pushing against. The Russians weren't the first outsiders to reach this coast. Spanish galleons had traced Alaska's shores back in the 1500s. French and British ships had come later, and now a new player had arrived, merchants from the young United States of America, known to the Tlingit as the Boston Men. The Tlingit were sharp traders. They had exchanged furs with Europeans for iron tools and other goods for years, but the American merchants brought something far more valuable: guns and gunpowder. Baranov was alarmed. He banned Russian traders from selling firearms to the Tlingit, but he had no authority over American ships, and those ships kept coming. Day by day, the Tlingit arsenal grew. Some warriors now carried American rifles. Some wore armor reinforced with Chinese coins obtained through trade. One Tlingit leader was reported to keep 20 fine guns close at hand at all times. Baranov could see what was coming. A new kind of war was being loaded, one bullet at a time.
Resentment had been building for years. Russian hunting expeditions were devastating the sea otter population, the very resource the Tlingit had traded for generations. Russian outposts were appearing on land the Tlingit considered their own, and the Russians treated their indigenous allies with open contempt, extracting labor and tribute by force. In the villages, a warrior named Katlian of the Kiksadi Raven clan began sending quiet messages between the clans. The time had come. In the spring of 1802, while Baranov's associate Ivan Kuskov led a massive hunting expedition down the coast, the Tlingit struck. They attacked the main Russian base. Every Russian inside was killed. The fort was burned to the ground. Word reached Baranov. He began preparing his response. Katlian knew the Russians would return. The Kiksadi clan abandoned their village and relocated to a defensible peninsula. Around their new settlement, they built a massive palisade, 245 feet across, reinforced with heavy timbers and fitted with gun ports for their cannons. They called it the Sapling Fort. The decision to fortify was not taken lightly. Only 2 decades earlier, Russian merchants had massacred around 300 Alutiiq men, women, and children near Kodiak Island after those people resisted Russian settlement. The Tlingit had not forgotten. Meanwhile, Baranov assembled his largest force yet, over 100 armed Russians, several ships, and hundreds of indigenous allies. And then came an unexpected addition, the Neva, a Russian naval warship that had just completed the first Russian circumnavigation of the globe, and whose captain had heard about the situation in Alaska and come to help. October 1804. The Russian fleet anchored before the Sapling Fort. October 1st. The sun was sinking low over the water. Katlian prepared himself for battle. He pressed his hands into charcoal and drew dark lines across his face, the image of a fallen raven. He put on his raven helmet. He picked up a hammer taken from a Russian blacksmith killed in the 1802 uprising. Then he turned to his warriors and told them, "Today we are prepared to die." The Russians advanced toward the fort, dragging artillery through the shallows. Tlingit gunfire tore into their ranks. The formation began to break. Some soldiers turned and ran. Katlian seized the moment. He led his warriors out through the gates. What followed was brutal, close-quarters combat. A sailor was hoisted on a Tlingit spear. Katlian himself reportedly crushed several enemies with his hammer before the Russians managed to retreat to their ships under covering cannon fire. Around 10 Russians were killed, 24 were wounded, including Baranov himself, shot through the arm. The Tlingit had won the first day. Over the next several days, the fort's walls held against naval bombardment. But Katlian understood the reality. Their gunpowder was running low. They could not hold indefinitely. While entering into negotiations with the Russians, the Kiksadi began slipping away in the darkness. First the elders, then the women and children, then the warriors, moving silently through soaked forest and over frozen mountain passes toward Peril Strait. Hunger and cold took the lives of many along the way. On October 7th, the Russians entered the fort. It was empty. Inside, they found only a few elderly people and young children, those who could not survive the journey, killed by their own clan rather than left to the Russians. The fort was burned. In its place, Baranov founded a new settlement he called New Archangel. The following summer, exiled Tlingit representatives arrived at New Archangel to negotiate. Kotlian came. A Russian officer wrote of him, "He is considered the best shot among them and keeps with him up to 20 fine guns." Baranov received his former enemy with respect. There were days of ceremonial dances, songs, and the exchange of gifts. Baranov traded a prized copper crest for the right to settle the land around New Archangel. Prisoners were exchanged. A fragile peace was established. But to the north, other Tlingit clans were not finished. Russian restrictions on traditional fishing grounds had pushed communities toward starvation. Tlingit warriors attacked the Russian post at Yakutat, killing every Russian inside and burning it to the ground. That post was never rebuilt. History books rarely mention this war. Napoleon was reshaping Europe. Lewis and Clark were pushing into the American interior. The world was transforming at breathtaking speed. But in this quiet corner of Alaska, a native nation had fractured a colonial frontier. Russian America grew. New Archangel became its capital. But the mass settlement that defined American westward expansion never happened here. No waves of Russian colonists, no forced removal of the Tlingit people. In the 1820s, the Tsar signed orders forbidding merchants from taxing or demanding tribute from the Tlingit, directing that every effort be made to preserve their goodwill. It was a remarkable document, one produced not by Russian generosity, but by Tlingit resistance. When Baranov retired in 1818, Tlingit chiefs came to bid him farewell. Among them was Kotlian, the man who had driven Baranov's forces from the field on the first day of battle, the man Baranov had come to deeply respect. The 71-year-old governor sailed away. He died of illness before reaching Russia. Kotlian lived on, and in time his people were permitted to return to Sitka. All along the coast, totem poles still rose above the waterline. Great houses still stood at the forest's edge. Canoes still moved through the morning mist. An empire had come. A people had held their ground. And the story was almost never told.